Can you walk and chew bubblegum at the same time? Can you have sex and talk to your girl if she starts asking you about feelings, stuff? You're like, I'm trying to fucking lay some pipe or receive pipe, depending on what gender you are. Didn't even say actually whether it's man or woman involved there. Point is, doing two things at the same time is tough, right? Well, for some people, you know. I mean, I'm trying to just relate to the common man or woman or whatever gender Canada requires me to call them at this point in time. But anyway, you got to pretty much get good at one and then maybe the other and then integrate the two. And then eventually you can do both at once. So when it comes to fragging and thinking, Boomeo caters for both aspects. If you want to learn to be a better at fragging, etc., they've got the tools there to allow you to. You can play duels mode, try out a bunch of different spots. You can use the pre-fire mode to really hone your skills. Then if you want to think a little bit, you hop right over. You watch some guides from like Shocks and Fallen and Nothing, tutorial videos, read articles. It's all sorts of shit over there. And you can even try it for free. Now get the fuck out of my face. Now, this concept, the Principles series, is something I've been thinking about for a while because even though a lot of my Thorin's Thoughts videos are on a specific topic, and if it's a big topic and it's a key one, you know, I'll often address it, and then unless there's a reason to update it, I won't go back and make another video. That'll just be the video on that topic. I wanted to have like a subtopic, a subset within that, which is like principles of Counter-Strike. And I take a key principle that's very abstract and I give examples and I lay it out for you. So just as there's the Who Is series, where that's part of Thorin's Thoughts, this is going to be part of it as well. So a great topic to start with is the concept of in-game leaders and fragging, because you will have heard it's been a very hard pushed topic of the notion of the low fragging in-game leader. And the question is, can you have one? Now, the stereotype of this, like the in-game leader is the guy who's the low fragger, he's bottom of the scoreboard, he doesn't contribute that much impact in terms of frags, but you know, he's the in-game leader and he has the tactics, and that's just part of the role, as it were. Now, yeah, the stereotype comes from 1.6, but what's funny is, a lot of people who didn't play 1.6 or played it only briefly are either selectively going to remember examples of that and think, oh, well, that's what it was like in 1.6. And in 1.6 is a game, you could do that, you know, but you can't in CSGO, and especially not in the modern day. And they always tie it into this notion of, you know, because the game's evolved to such a level now, and all the players know all the spots and the roles. By the way, every single one of those, like, blanket statements I'd absolutely destroy and could break down and show how they're totally ludicrous notions, you know. It would be like saying in the NBA, oh, every player in the NBA understands, like, pick and roll offense and how to defend every position and how to make every shot and which angles they should shoot shots from. No, they might in some aspects have been taught better, but the idea that they know better and that they're better than all the great players of history, no, that's a ludicrous notion. But anyway, let's not get under a digression. So the point is, even back in 1.6, this stereotype did not actually fit if you go and look at the successful teams. Like, okay, yeah, there are some players who really did fit that stereotype, and they were really good in-game leaders who ran their team very well and had a tactical approach and ran the system, the style that the team plays around which star players and which supportive players they have, and weren't good fraggers. So some famous examples would be like Threat, who was always on the third or the fourth best Swedish teams, but wasn't a very good fragger, just had basically like sat like a bot and just sprayed. You had Bit One from the MIBR, a guy who certainly could be like an AWPer sometimes, or was an okay fragger, but it was mainly about having a tactical leader, and Brazil didn't have many leaders. You had Cuban, when in the latter years of the Golden Five, he took his turn as the in-game leader. And this is someone where, yeah, again, not a big fragger, not a super skilled player, but someone who could fit into a supportive system, knew all his teammates. Fucking hell, never do videos with colds, but I need that scritter. Don't actually, just want it. Yeah, bit difference between needs and wants. Cuban obviously had the benefit of knowing his teammates a long time. Hearts from the French scene, another player where people actually might remember him from CSGO early on as well. He was in Clan Mystic when they won at ESWC in 2013. Someone, again, not a particularly skilled player, a very low skill player, but someone who's famous for his tactical style, especially within France, and famously existence of Very Games, Titan, now into LDLC. So supposedly even, you know, considered him like a mentor figure and took a lot of cues from him. You had Alex over in the Chinese scene, WNV, when they became one of the best teams in the world from China at the end of 2005. Everyone was like, what the fuck, how did they do this? Because Alex studied the Western teams, and he was a very low skill player, but he was able to look at that, take this Western meta and apply a bit of it, infuse it with the Chinese style of play, which is this weird semi-aggressive style and low econ style and playing around the star players and having lots of good aimers, but he had this low fragging style. he was able to make that work and make his teams in general much better than the other Chinese teams ever were. And then finally, I would list Tripp, the North American player, best known for playing, obviously he's the in-game leader of Complexity, but before that he was in United 5 where he wasn't the in-game leader. Again, not a guy with mad skills. Yeah, he had a couple of clips that were good, but in general, for the fragging, you looked at the other members of the team, particularly obviously Fraud, and then you looked at like Storm rather, and then maybe Sunman and Warden were like half and half, but they were more supportive players in that period in time. It wasn't a very high skill level team, as Warden himself would tell you. So now that we've got those examples out of the way, you might think that's quite a long list of examples there. Well, first of all, those examples I listed there, barely, except for Cuban, who, by the way, wasn't the in-game leader for most of the majors they won. Taz was usually for that team. Most of those lineups there actually didn't win many of the majors. So what's funny is it's not even like the most successful in-game leaders of all time with these low fraggers. No, not really. In fact, there were lots who were either average to above average to very good fraggers. So let's look at like the good or above average fraggers for an in-game leader. So, okay, Lopez is a great one because actually he used to be not a star player, but kind of like a middle of the pack player in his teams, then became the in-game leader and still was a good fragger actually. Had many big tournaments where he had good stats and good numbers and could certainly get frag within his system, which was at times a bit of a loose system. It was like a hybrid because he had the Finnish players and then later in North America. It was a hybrid, loose and tactical style at the same time. He gave room for his stars certainly, and he could absolutely frag up there better than a lot of in-game leaders. Ave is a very good one because on the surface, if you look at his skills to me weren't very good. So you'd look at it and you'd think, right, low skilled, maybe, right? But good at fragging? No, he was good at fragging. That's the key thing because what happened was in his teams, very tactical teams, these NOA, MTW teams, the key was within his tactics, he always knew where to put himself and could do his job to a high level, that it meant that the fragging was good. So actually he wouldn't count as a low fragging in-game leader in that respect, even though in terms of skill, certainly he's not as good as some of the others on this list. I would actually say a very forgotten one is a guy called Moon, a German player, a very old school player going back to TAM in the early 2000s, but later on most famous with Alternate Attacks, 2006, and then the 2 or 3 years going beyond that, even when he lost his best players. By 2007, this guy was a very good tactician, had a very set style, but was a fantastic fragger and was a really good actual AWPer as well. He had this little couple of years where he was a really special, unique in-game leader who's a very tactical guy, but very good fragger as well. But I've put him into the just good category because his whole career he wasn't beyond that. And also, again, it was within his tactical system that he was good. I'd also say Arcadian, best known for being in the second and the third best Danish teams in general when he was the main in-game leader. And he's a guy where could certainly light it up with the rifle within his teams and was mainly known for, yes, some anti-strike, etc., but beyond that would then frag himself. I would actually say Pronax in 1.6 was a decent enough fragger. He wasn't terrible. He wasn't relative to the other players as bad as he has been in CSGO most of the time. Taz, obviously, when he was the in-game leader, was an in-game leader, and he wasn't the star player until the latter days, when he joined Neo was kind of a star. But during the times they were winning all their majors, he was a very good player, and he could be the in-game leader and the entry fragger and hold key spots as a CT. So in that sense, I think his fragging was a little bit underrated at some times, although obviously the main star of the team was Neo. It was like a super carry. You had Khan. Now, Khan actually had periods like 2007, 2008, where individually he was a really good fragger for an in-game leader, but he also had more of a loose style, so it was to be expected. But there were times in those years where he might have been the third best player on some of those teams once they lost tentpole and was the in-game leader at the same time. And finally, I'd list Hare. So Moses' brother, in-game leader of United 5. A tactical team, and he had good players on his team, Moses, Fraud, obviously, but he was also a solid fragger as an in-game leader and knew where to put himself within the system. Now, if you want to talk about very good fraggers in 1.6, we can go down some of these lists, and these are fucking legendary names, and these guys were on some of the best teams ever, going to major finals, etc. And so the idea that stereotype just fits everyone in 1.6, it's just nonsense. Like, here's a few. Valle and Robban took different times to be the in-game leader of SK Gaming, and before that, Valle was the in-game leader of NIP, obviously. They were pretty good fraggers for in-game leaders. I mean, funnily enough, both AWPers, actually, and it could both be the primary AWPer even as the in-game leader, but pretty solid players. Valle, obviously, all-time great player. God B is an obvious one, because he was a pretty tactical in-game leader, fragged within his system, and he was also one of the star players. Like, once you went past 6, I would have God B as my second best player. I always thought Cappy actually took more of a backseat in that Mouse Sports compared to when he was the star of attack. So God B, fantastic player, and could even call the game around himself to some degree to allow himself to frag. Before him in mouse sports, you had a guy called Blizzard, who was a very stable player, a very solid player, and he was the in-game leader for a couple of years during, again, some of their prime era, 2005 sort of era. And I'd finally throw in another North American. I'd say Moto, when he was in the Speakeasy Offensive, TSO, because this was a team that went undefeated in Cal Invite, went to the CPL, finished 5th, actually could have made it higher. They had a great game against SK Gaming in the upper bracket, and he was one of the star players, if not the best player in the team, fragging, AWPing, doing everything while being a very tactical in-game leader. So it's absolutely not the case that there was this set stereotype and that everyone fitted in 1.6. Now, I will say, because 1.6 rewarded positional play more, because the flashbangs weren't as powerful, the smokes weren't as powerful, and there was no Molotov, actually, in a sense, tactics actually had, this might sound bizarre, had more effect on the game, because first of all, positioning meant that if you have better positioning of your one or two players against their one or two players, then you have more of a chance of getting the kill. But secondly, because of the weakness of the utility, the more effective you are with it, the more rounds you're going to win based on tactics alone. Now, the fact that the utility is so strong in CSGO, combined with other factors like the OP pistols, the economy management being different, and the fact that the game doesn't reward positional play and spraying as much, means that yes, a lot of skill is involved in CSGO, and the impact of having to have high skill, it's clearly a much better route in general to go. And so as such, yes, I would say in general, you can make the general approach to actually all roles in CSGO, that most of them tend to have a higher skill requirement than there was in 1.6, because I think you can play with your brain a little bit less, especially because of some of the economical components. But the point is, when we go into CSGO now, people take this narrative that, right, that was a thing of 1.6, the low fragging in-game leader, that was 1.6, so you know what, it was the early days of CSGO and people hadn't figured it out. Now, the funny thing is, the modern narrative that people have been pushing so hard for every year from like 2015 onwards is this notion that you can't have the in-game leader anymore who's a low fragger. Like, that role just doesn't work anymore. There's no room for it in the game. And in fact, look at the successful teams. They're the ones that have the players who can frag and be the in-game leader. And the problem I have with that is, it actually is very similar to the narrative that, here's the big problem. That people use it, but then they'll cite the most extreme examples of it. So they'll cite like, oh, look, I mean, you look at Fallen, he's one of the superstars of the team in the in-game leader. You look at Shox, in-game leader, superstar. Stewie UK in the Cloud9 when they were good. Yeah, he's the in-game leader, but the star player. Or even Angel now in Hellraisers, one of the best players, best fraggers, but he's the in-game leader. What that betrays, though, is that those are the really extreme examples. You go out there and you look in the scene, and yeah, you have some less example ones of the ones that extreme ones of the ones that are good. Like, yeah, you can say Glave's pretty good fragger, very good tactical in-game leader. Neo, okay, half like a hybrid loose tactical style, obviously very set smokes, etc. But again, pretty good fragger for an in-game leader, but not a very, very good one. But then you look out there and there's plenty that are having success relative to how good their teams are, who are the low fraggers, right? You can go look at Gob B in Big. And I realize people are immediately going to go, what do you mean he had great stats at the EU minor? Yeah, the EU minor. Go look at this guy's whole career. I've watched it in CSGO. Very low fragger. Fantastic in-game leader, though, and has a lot of success with his teams relative to who he's got and makes more out of them than they would be in other lineups. Sean Gares, still around with Misfits, had a decent placing at DreamHack Tours. Yes, it's been a long time since he's been on top, but always been a low fragger, and yet has been someone who's been able to get the most in general out of the teammates he's played with. MSL right now, despite all that storyline that he told us at DreamHack Vegas about changing his sensitivity, right, yes, he has the odd game. Here's a classic thing that people need to understand in Counter-Strike. If you see someone where everyone's like, that player's not very good, he's quite bad, he's inefficient, and the guy has one big map, go and look at the average, right? Because what you'll realize is, well, that means actually that he's usually way worse than that. That's why his average is all the way down here. If he was having good maps like that all the time, his average would be great and people wouldn't say it, would they? Use your brain when you say these things, okay? You don't point to one example. You don't point to the outlier and go, see, the outlier, that must mean that the average is wrong. Well, no, it's the other way around, isn't it? The outlier is the one that's the least relevant of it all, and when put in a context, actually makes the average what it is, right? It's not like the guy has 2 frags every time, otherwise the average wouldn't be fucking 10 frags, would it? It would be 2. Use your head. So MSL, yes, because he's freed himself up a little bit from some of the tactics, can perform a little bit better. Still, historically, a very low fragging in-game leader. Still fits that stereotype to some extent. Right now, CLG have had a couple of good results. FNS, absolutely not a very skilled player. Not a guy who's going to be a high fragger. But within his system, allowing those young stars to compete the way they do, and then putting in place the way that they play the game, and then within that being all right at fragging, not a good one, admittedly, down there, he's someone who clearly makes it work. I would even say Steel from Immortals. Immortals have had a bunch of runs this year where they looked pretty good. Yes, they're very on and off, but a lot of that comes down to their star players like Henny have an FNX who's causing personality problems. Phelps wasn't quite ready to blossom into the superstar player and obviously needed to play with other stars in SK. So I think Steel's done a very good job in Immortals, actually, with what he's got. You look at the in-game leaders they had before that, those guys struggled. You have Zeus over in Gambit. I realize people now want to make out like he's some really good player. No, he's a great in-game leader still, and always was. Never for a day was this guy not a great in-game leader. But he's not a great fragger either. He's got the talent elsewhere in his team. And I finally just throw in there Blade. This guy qualifies for every major, despite the fact he's clearly not a high-skill, high-fragging in-game leader, and works typically with young talent, either unproven or just not that good, and makes miracles out of it. So it does work, depending on the level you're at, relative to have the low-fragging in-game leader. So the big problem with this concept that you can't have the low-fragging in-game leader is it's too simplistic. There's nothing in sport, team sports or Counter-Strike that works this way. It would be like going in the NFL and saying, oh, you can only have, right nowadays, the game's evolved so much, the only offense you can have is a pass, like a quick passing offense, You can't run the ball anymore. Well, depends who you got on your team, doesn't it? If you've got a fucking superstar running back, that obviously doesn't make any sense, does it? It depends. Yes, there might be a style that is currently more effective and maybe more effective within the metagame of how everyone else plays. That could be the case. But there's no hard and fast rule, and it's definitely not based on the idea that we've evolved to this point, therefore we've gone past that and we'll never again need that, or that'll never be viable again. That just doesn't work. What it depends on, because, by the way, this is a topic where it reminds me of when people talk about teams in general, about their style, like, the tactical level of a team. Experts and pros have been doing the same thing. So last year they were telling you like, you have to try and be less rigid in your tactics and less set things, just play off individual players. Oh, you mean because SK Gaming is the best team and that's what they do because they happen to have a personnel that can do that? No, everyone should do that. That doesn't even make sense, does it? Because Na'Vi was super tactical and they were fantastic. Astralis came along at the end of the year after SK, very tactical team, much less about individual plays, became the number one team. It depends on the personnel and who the teams are at the time. So what kills me about that logic is that it ignores the fact that there are always going to be multiple different styles for in-game leaders, for teams, and that it's a spectrum from one extreme to the other. You're never going to be one extreme or the other and have only that work. Some teams might be more near the extremes than the others. A lot of them are going to be grouped mainly around the middle, leaning one way or the other, depending on who they have. Because the key thing to me about the low fragging aspect, and it also applies to the style aspect, that'll have its own video though, is that this factor of how much should your in-game leader frag is entirely predicated, in my opinion, on your personnel. So we're talking about the team you're in and who is in that team, and then the style that you choose to play. Now, funnily enough, the style that you choose to play should ideally also be predicated on the team you're in and who else is in that team. The key distinction being that while if I was the in-game leader and I saw who I have as a set of players, I might select a style that could be used, and that might be the ideal way to do it, the in-game leader having full control. Some teams, yes, because of the star players, might demand that they play a certain way, and therefore not play maybe the most efficient or what you would choose as the in-game leader as the style of play. So that can change the style of play. But the point is, in general, the personnel you have immediately sets how you're going to pick the style, and then, as a result, from within that, don't put the cart before the horse, tells you which type of in-game leader you'd need to run that kind of a system. So resources essentially determine what kind of in-game leader you want and can afford to have. So let's give some examples. Let's go abstract and then put examples into it, okay? So let's imagine we had a very tactical team. So, okay, we'll go ahead. We'll say Dignitas of early 2016. Remember the one where Kirby was like the main star, he'd blossomed. Config was very hit and miss. I hadn't quite found his role yet. You had Rubino was like in the middle of the pack and wasn't the main support player at the time. You had Tensky was the support player, and you had MSL low-fragging in-game leader. So Dignitas early 2016. Now, in a team like this, a very tactical team, you're probably going to want to have lots of supportive players who therefore give up what they're doing to make the overall tactic work more, play small little roles overall to make the star player more effective within that system. So let's have a look. In this team, we've got three supportive players. We've got Rubino, it's kind of hybrid, Tensky, definitely a support player, and MSL low frag, tactical in-game leader, and therefore support player. So we've got three support players, we've got tactical stuff. So we're going to need an in-game leader, right, who's pretty smart, right, in this tactical team to read the game well and have tactics prepared. So we've got MSL, ideal. We're going to probably have to have set pieces within this team because our skill level isn't high enough that we can just make incredible plays and win the game. We need to have set plays which put our players in a position which is favorable for them to be able to make a kill, make an entry, not just based on skill alone. So teams like Big are obviously great examples, but in this Dignitas lineup, we saw on Cobblestone, they were pretty naturally good. They were pretty solid on Mirage when they got the right opponents. So in general, the in-game leader for this very tactical team is probably going to be less skilled in general. And the team is going to be one in which the couple of stars they might have, they're only going to have a couple because they don't want to have too few supportive players. And they're going to be a couple of stars who themselves might have a little bit of freedom, but it's also based on the others supporting that freedom. So again, you're putting the cart before the horse if you think to yourself that, oh, well, what we'll do is, right, what kind of in-game leader do we need for this team? It's like, well, no, well, what personnel do you have and how would that work with that in-game leader? So obviously MSL was one of the best in-game leaders you could have had for that lineup of team, and they had, relative to their level, they didn't have the players to be a top 5 team in the world. They had some decent success. It was very hit and miss, obviously. Now let's go and look at what would happen if you had a very loose team. So I'm going to use the example of Envious of early 2015. So it was the one, if you remember that one, the X Games Aspen, and the year before had won the last major during that winter 2014. This was the lineup that had Shox as an entry fragger, Kiyashima as a semi-entry fragger as well. They had Smiths as like the AWPer and just a middling player. They had MBK as like the primary support player, playing with Happy, who was the star player of the team and was the lurker, and a very loose in-game leading style. So there we go. There's a very loose team. We've got Envious 2015. So they're probably going to need a lot of strong fragging players to make this loose style work. So, well, look, they already had Shox, Happy, and Kiyashima. Now, admittedly, Shox wasn't the Shox he is now in G2. Admittedly, I don't mean now, because now he's an in-game leader, so it doesn't make sense. He wasn't the Shox of last year in G2. He was the monster star, did all the roles he wanted, was very aggressive, but at the same time put himself in all the key spots to win the clutches and open. No, he was set much more as an entry fragger, and so within that, he was very skilled, but he had to adapt to that role. Even so, very good at it, especially early in 2015. Then you had Happy, who was a monster lurker, putting up insane numbers every game and could dominate from lurking. And you had Kiyashima, who was a very high skill, entry-ish player who could open and crack open sites for you that were even tough ones dry with Shox. So you have 3 star aimer type players in this scenario, or skill type players. I wouldn't say Happy's an aim, he's a skill player, certainly. And even the others at the time were actually still pretty good, especially pre-2015. Like Smiths, before the CZ nerf, was a pretty strong player relative to his role. If it was like the 4th best player in the team. And MBK as a support player was absolutely overqualified. He was a very, very strong support player at the time. Now, within this team, we're going to need an in-game leader who can make reads mid-round in the game, or at the beginning of a round, but not very set tactics and not very set strategy. It's just mainly about making basic reads and adapt heavily just based on what his players do. Which, by the way, he obviously can't entirely know. So Happy, again, fits this criteria entirely, right? Depending on what his players are roughly doing, he's going to call a quick attack without massive amounts of utility and therefore coordination. And obviously, in his case, he's not doing set tactics, set pieces like they are in their very tactical team. It's more about creating matchups that are going to favor your strong players rather than in specific strats. So in this case, Envious, one of the most famous of all time, the Death Ball, the 4-in-1. Happy over here, which triggers a 4-man attack or a 3-man attack on a specific corner or a site where if they're on low econ, it's going to be the CZ running round. And otherwise, people are going to walk in like Kiyashima and Shox and just see you and frag your head off without throwing a pop flash and without throwing smokes, without the enemy knowing and setting up a counter flashes. Just going to walk in and kill you. So in this scenario, this in-game leader, since he's not doing a whole lot of set tactics and he's working off skill, he's probably going to need to be able to frag to some degree himself as well. Because when the tactics aren't always working, there's no consistency for it, he has to be able to frag as well. He has to be able to do something in his role, as you've seen now in Envious, when Happy can't get it going, to himself have an impact on the game, because just his brain isn't having the impact alone now. And obviously Happy absolutely fit that criteria. He's one of the best players in the world, and definitely the best player in that team. Now, why is it in general that we even have this distinction between like low fragging game leaders and high fragging game leaders? Usually it's the background of the players. Like, if you're a player who started out not as an in-game leader and you were like a very skilled player, or you were among the pack of skilled players and you had set roles and you had resources and space given to yourself, and you were very good, and then later became an in-game leader, you're probably going to retain some of that while learning some tactics, while building yourself around some of your other teammates, but you're never going to go so far to the other extreme, mostly. So players like Khan, like Godby, etc., it makes sense to some degree, like Happy, that they would play this style. I mean, Happy's actually a very unique one because in that sense, he actually was a tactical in-game leader at one point in time, but obviously he adopted the skill approach in general. Now, a lot of the low-skill, low-fragging in-game leaders were support players who switched to in-game leader, or they were always the in-game leader. So they were someone like an MSL, they were someone who else would you pick for the low-fraggy ones? You could say like Zeus, like Blade. Who else did I have on there? Steele, already mentioned him. These are the players where there's a logic as to why they would go the more low-fragging route. And therefore, since they already understand how to support a team and they've played within a team, they're also going to put a lot of their work, because they know they're not going to get it done just fragging and having a loose system. They're also going to put a lot more time into learning the game, which they've already done some of as a support player, but on an intuitive level with their teammates and working with the in-game leader. And then when they become the in-game leader, they're going to work on tactics a lot more and scouting the opponent a lot more. They're going to try and make up their disadvantage in that way, whereas the other guy's going to make up his disadvantage or create advantages. That's probably a better way to say it. Just as the low-skill, low-fragging game leader will create advantages by studying the game and getting very deep tactics and trying to use his players more efficiently, the other player, the loose-style one, is going to figure out how to let those players use themselves, the star players, be as effective as possible, and make himself as effective as possible fragging-wise within his loose system. So his loose system benefits him, if he's a high fragger, as much as it benefits his stars. Well, maybe not as much, but it certainly benefits him more so than a tactical system. Just as the very tactical system benefits the low-fragging in-game leader, and also benefits his stars in their own way by having support. And maybe on that one, actually, it's more extreme the other way. So the point being made here is there is a spectrum. And it's between the two extremes, and very rarely someone goes really all the way to one extreme or the other. The more loose your style in general, the more likely your in-game leader probably needs some fragging to be able to still allow your team chances to win, because you won't have as much of a consistent structure to go back, because you're just going off the individual skill of the players and individual playmaking, which has a lot more variables to it, because people don't necessarily entirely know what they're going to do themselves, and therefore the reactions, there's no way to flow chart it out. Whereas a heavy tactical style takes care of some of that and does streamline some of it so people know what they're doing in that respect. You're not doing as much thinking-wise if you are the high fragging in-game leader in the loose style, and therefore we need you to do more fragging because you're capable of it. The more restrictive style, the more tactical style, your in-game leader, yes, likely will be lower fragging because he's got to orchestrate this whole system. He's got plans to unfold, he has to move his pieces around, and then he has to constantly think about all this while playing his own role within it, probably a lower skilled role within the team as well, therefore unlikely to get as many frags. And so the point is, it depends on the team you have and the style that you're going to play. It's not as simple as just thinking it's skill-based for personnel as well. Like, I gave that as a basic principle because in general, that's the way things will trend. But you will still get teams that go the other way. So for example, Na'Vi early 2016, the one where Starix could be the in-game leader as the coach, and they still had Zeus but just as a support player, they were an incredibly tactical team, but they had very high skill level for a tactical team. In fact, one of the highest skilled teams in the world. And then Astralis 2017, so the most consistent team of the year, has pretty high skill level across all the positions, and yet they're a very tactical team. Now, that's also because, remember, just as mentality of players and can mean that the personnel can shift your style to be ineffective, in this sense, the players haven't gone with the principle, which is that we're high-skilled players, so let's play a loose style. They've actually gone, we're high-skilled players, but we're going to have the mentality of the supportive players in many members of the team, Dupree, Zipniks, etc. And therefore, we're willing to actually play a tactical style. That's actually why these teams are very dynamic and very dangerous and very hard to beat in that particular sense. And it's no coincidence. Those two teams, arguably the most consistent two teams, if you look over like a 6-month span at the beginning of the year, always placing top 4, always placing second. Both those teams managed to do it because they had very high skill level and a very tactical skill. But guess what? That's a very unique set of teams there. I mean, funnily enough, in terms of Astralis, yes, it was people buying into having the mentality of more supportive players and playing as a team. In Na'Vi, it was also people buying into the in-game leader. Like, they tried in the past with Zeus, the very extreme style and playing off Guardian, and that hadn't worked enough. So they then bought into the Starix system even further. And then, even though individually they are players who might want to make plays, they were willing to take on what they were told to do in that system and kind of subdue their egos to some degree and be very good as a result. Now, funnily enough, likewise, you look at some of the teams right now, and there are teams where the principle suggests who they should get, they just can't because he's not available. So Cloud9 and Optic have a bunch of weapons. So you'd think, right, you want to play a looser style, let those weapons really be effective, and you probably want a fragging in-game leader to make that work. Problem is, there is no fragging in-game leader of the type we're talking about who runs a loose system who you could put into their teams right now who would work. So therefore, they have no choice in that sense. So actually, they need to go the other route and get a low fragging one, like an FNS probably. Then you go over to some teams like, I mean, the classic example right now would be Envious, right? Envious is a team that has a bunch of what seem like good players, but they're actually players who wouldn't fit a loose style and are trying to play a loose style right now, and it doesn't really work. They aren't players with initiative to do what they want to do and who you just need a simple style around, and their in-game lead at the moment isn't that great at fragging anyway. Well, the funny thing is, Envious probably needs a tactical in-game leader right now. They just don't have one right now, and hence they're very ineffective as well for the talent that they have in their team rather. So both ends of the spectrum will always exist. And even if at some point in time people are leaning generally as a trend towards one way, the other will always be viable in some context depending on who you have on your team. And sometimes if you have this very specific personnel whose style suits a specific team style, it will be better to have what goes against the current trend than what is currently stuck in the current trend. Same as there will always be a direct counter to whatever is the most meta tactic or style of play. And it will always be cycles. People will always rotate through them. As people get success in one aspect, people will ape that, and then someone will counter it, and then someone will ape that, and you will always move around and between the spectrum. It will never be always one way. It's definitely not a progression from one to the other, as some people try to naively suggest in terms of the narrative for the low-fragging in-game leader and whether he can exist anymore. He does, they do, and it depends on the team as to how good and how effective he is.
Hey guys, this is Patrick Carl-Sedermoon. You might know me as the guy with the most IM medals in the world, or something like that. I'm also the CGO Fnatic, and you're watching Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. Pleasure being here.
Hello guys, this is Gabriel Falling from Team SK Gaming.